had a particular impetus to look at the history of tariffs in the U.S.
Yes.
So first of all, I'll say what tariffs are. I'll talk about what that impetus is. I'll mention it briefly before we go into it more at the end, and then we'll get into that history. So tariffs are taxes on foreign goods. Simple as that. Taxes on imports that are paid by the importers. So we import stuff into America, and the company that is buying the thing from a foreign country and importing it pays a tax on that good. All right. The reason that we're looking at this is because recent news has come out about Donald Trump floating a 60% tariff on all Chinese goods.
Not 6, not 16, 60.
60.
60.
That is a ridiculously high tariff.
Oh, and you know what? To give Trump some credit, turns out that was a little bit of a lie. Because the Washington Post interviewed him, and they're like, hey, Trump, did you push for a 60% tariff? And he's like, no, I want it to be higher than 60.
Yeah.
That's what we're dealing with here.
So we're
not talking about tariffs around the edges of 10, 5%. We're talking about a 60, but he's saying a higher than 60% tariff.
Yeah. So, but we want to give it credit. We want to do our homework and figure out what tariffs do exactly. What is the history of them? So we're going to go through that. What do they look at in America?
How did the U.S. use them in the past?
Yeah. Well, and I want to start by not even how the U.S. used tariffs, but before the revolution, how tariffs were wielded against us. So the Townshend Acts were responses to the 7 Years' War. So basically, the 7 Years' War was fought between Britain and France on American soil. Each of them had colonists there, and they were fighting for territory that were a little bit west of the British colonies, right? After the war, so the war goes on for 7 years. The Brits win, basically, and they are in massive debt that they've used to finance the war, and now they need sources of income. And they figure, well, let's just put a tax on these colonists. And the first thing they do is the stamp tax, right? And the stamp tax is basically on every publication, every piece of mail that is sent in the American colonies, that a little bit of that income goes to, a percentage of that goes to Great Britain, the mother country. Americans hated this. Stamp tax was repealed after 1 year, but they still need a way to extract that money. So they come up with the Townshend Acts, which tax a bunch of different, a bunch of goods that Americans can't really make on their own, and so that they need to import from Great Britain. It taxes those imports. It's the first kind of real example of tariffs in the colonies. And besides that, there's the case of exemption of tariffs on tea imports for the East India Trading Company. So this made colonists super mad, because this meant the East India Trading Company couldn't be competed with by colonial tea makers. And this is, of course, leads to the Boston Tea Party, leads to the idea of taxation without representation, and is a huge reason for the beginning of revolution in and of itself.
So what this Townshend Act did, it taxed foreign tea, but not British tea.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yes.
Right. And a lot of American founding fathers, I think John Adams was one of them, was actually a smuggler bringing Dutch tea into the U.S. market.
Yeah.
So that totally fucked him up. And then he helped plan the Boston Tea Party.
Yes, totally. So I think that's a good baseline to show the political effects that tariffs can have, and that's going to be a thread that underlies the rest of this long history. Okay? So then you get into the Revolutionary War, and during the Revolution, there's a fledgling manufacturing industry that starts to pop up in the U.S. Now, obviously, they were not competing with the Europeans. This is not even a country yet. These are just colonies. They've been reliant on getting manufactured goods from the Europeans forever. But during the war, they suddenly had more of a reason to start manufacturing. And it wasn't even high-level manufacturing. They were barely making weapons. They were making some, but it was lower down on the value chain, or it was in other areas like manufacturing textiles and clothing. They need clothes.
We basically got all of our guns from France.
Totally.
You know?
We got almost all of our guns from France. We were starting to manufacture steel, right? So that we could at least try to repair some of the weapons that we did have.
Cool.
But we were extremely high up in the value chain, or like we were far behind the end goods, kind of. Then after the war, we still couldn't compete with European manufacturing at all, right? Which meant that this fledgling industry in the U.S. was highly at risk.
Yeah, it had no way to start up. They can't compete with the economies of scale that exist in Britain, Germany, and their textile manufacturing.
Exactly. And it got even worse because Britain passed the Navigation Acts, which impose really high prices on American shipments coming into Britain. Mm-hmm. So Britain is putting its own protectionist policies so that they can't be competed with via the Americans. Meanwhile, they're easily outcompeting the Americans on American soil, right? Also, none of the other European powers wanted to agree on fair trade deals. The Americans were just in a really bad negotiating position as far as making trade agreements. So even though, and instantly, right, the Continental Congress, which is the central government that forms in America after the Revolution but before the Constitution is signed, they want to institute tariffs. They see what's happening, but they were really weak. The state still had most of the power in this young post-revolutionary America, and the states did not want to give the central government the right to regulate commerce because that's what had just happened with Britain. Yep. And that was what was just caused their problems that led to the revolution. So instead, the individual states decided to impose their own tariffs, but that just caused a race to the bottom, right, for the European traders. And they just shipped all their goods into whatever state they could get them to with the least amount of taxes. And so now you have these interstate, like, commerce wars, these trade wars that are happening where they're placing tariffs not only on each other, but they're like changing tariffs on different European powers to try to extract goods from those Europeans. The early American government hates this, right? They need more unity. They need more federal power so that they don't have so much internal discord as far as their economics. Mm-hmm. So the Constitution finally comes in. The Constitution is passed. It's signed. It's ratified in 1789. And one of the first order of business is like, let's give the central government some power to regulate commerce. And they seek to aid manufacturers. Basically, they need two things, okay? They need income. Yeah. They have a bunch of debt after fighting the Revolutionary War, and they need a way to pay it off. And two, they need to protect manufacturing, as we just talked about. So they come up with the first Tariff Act. The Tariff Act of 1789 is actually the second piece of legislation that George Washington signs as the first president of the U.S.
That's cool.
It had two purposes. The two purposes that we just talked about: protect manufacturing, raise revenue for the government.
Yep. This is some very Alexander Hamilton type policy.
Yeah,
right here.
Hamilton was all about it. It was he wanted to increase the country's unity, protect manufacturing. The thing is, the tariffs were too low to actually work for protectionist purposes. They were only around like 5% for most things. They were higher on some of the goods that the U.S. produced, like steel and tobacco, but they still weren't high enough. Mm-hmm. What they were high enough for was revenue. There were some years after 1789 that the tariffs provided like 95% of the government's revenue.
That's crazy, yeah. The government didn't used to raise that much money.
No. It was raising less than $10 million a year. Yeah. Like, it was very, very little. So tariffs go on, and then the next time we get a Tariff Act is 1816. So we actually have a very similar position post-Revolutionary War, because instead it was post the War of 1812, mm-hmm. which was against the UK. And during the War of 1812, again, they needed to raise money to fund the war. They doubled the tariff rates from 1789. But after the war, the government was still in serious debt. So what it did was, even though it lowered those tariffs during the war, it increased tariffs on some goods that again they wanted to protect, right? Because they were in a position where the British could attack some of the most vulnerable but most important industries in the country, which at this time was still manufacturing, and in this case was textiles.
I want to focus in on that.
Yeah.
Because textiles is an industry that does really well in southern Germany. Silesia, the Silesian region of Germany, is like the textile capital of the world. UK, incredible at producing textiles. Extremely, extremely profitable. If the US wants to get into this market, it needs a way to compete, and it needs to shut out those foreign competitors.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about textiles is they're kind of like a finished product. They're not input goods at this point, right? A textile manufacturing plant is producing the textiles. Yes, it goes on to make, goes on to create, whatever, clothes and stuff. But this textile thing is imperative for the United States to be able to produce at home.
Definitely. Yeah. And so it did work in that some of the British, like, coarse textiles that the British exporters really dominated were blocked out of the market, and it did help the American manufacturers. But besides textiles, the Brits still dumped a ton of cheap goods onto the American market, and it did severely hurt manufacturers. However, the tariff was effective in raising revenue from the government. Then you go a few years after 1816, and in 1819, there is a panic and an economic depression, and suddenly tariff policy is called into question, right? Tariffs had been such an enormous source of revenue for the government that it was an obvious thing to look at and wonder, is this the thing hurting our economy? And so for the next, say, 80 years of the 1800s, tariffs are completely central to the political conversation. We have a lot of, I'll go through a lot of the details, but you have, in the 1820s, you have many Americans thinking they're essential to the country's independence and stability. And so honestly, when economists look back on it, they don't think tariffs actually had that big of an impact.
Yeah.
Because they tried low tariffs in times of recession, and it didn't necessarily help. They tried high tariffs in times of prosperity and recession. It didn't necessarily help. Recessions came whether tariffs were low or high, and it turns out the idea kind of is that America's economy was too unique, too complex and differentiated for tariffs on these individual goods to really make that much of a difference. So we skip forward to 1824, and we see the first tariff that is used purely for protectionism. So this one wasn't worried about revenue for the government. It was about protecting northern manufacturers, right?
Is this 1824?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is where the country is kind of splitting as far as the economy, right? The South is concentrated on cotton production, whereas the North is starting to get into manufacturing. A lot of the North is still farming, but about 20% of the North is now working on manufacturing. And that seems like a really important sector of the economy to keep safe. And that is going to kind of, they're looking at that like the future, and it's kind of how we think about chips now, right? Like, you need some of that to be domestic so that your national security is going to remain intact.
Yeah.
So Southerners opposed it because they were net consumers of those manufactured goods, while Northerners supported it because it strengthened their own industrial base. And that is the context that we found ourselves in for the next around a century. Southerners were anti-tariffs because they consumed the manufactured goods. Northerners were pro-tariff because they produced the goods and they wanted to protect the workers.
And I'll add this, throughout this time, there's whole bunches of calls of corruption. Of like, you're doing this because your buddy who owns the textile mill is getting you rich on the back end. And lobbying becomes very, very powerful with tariffs.
Yeah.
Tariffs and setting the tariff levels are huge in the later 19th century.
Yeah.
And it's where lobbying comes from, guys. It's like, literally, this tariff policy is how people started buying off government employees and government elected officials, and it's just a whole, I actually have a book on the shelf here called Private Power and American Democracy. The first 3 chapters are dedicated to the tariff wars and how tariffs were fought over in the halls of Congress, specifically by huge manufacturing companies.
It is the tool of special interest. And thinking about it, like, it does seem, it is kind of hard to defend, in my opinion, right?
Yeah.
And so neoliberalism, which we did a deep dive on, I think also one of our better ones.
So good.
Neoliberalism is all about free international trade. Tariffs are the clear antithesis to it. And when I think about this, and I think about how special interests use tariffs to protect themselves, it's really hard for me to think of of putting tariffs on certain goods but not others, right? It's hard to validate the case that only some manufacturing or only some jobs are worth protecting a certain amount. It's hard to politically support that and to hear that as someone who's manufacturing some of these goods that aren't worth protecting, apparently.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So that's where the Southerners were coming from. And then in 1828, this got crazy.
This is a big one.
So Southerners in Congress, again, South doesn't like tariffs, North likes tariffs. Southerners in Congress crafted a tariff bill that would also be imposed on goods that the northern states imported abundantly. So the idea was like, if the North is going to put tariffs on us to try to protect themselves, we're going to retaliate by putting tariffs on them and making it harder for them. And the Southern congressmen expected that the Northern congressmen would oppose the bill because of this. And then they could withdraw it while blaming the Northerners to consolidate support for Andrew Jackson. So they I'm trying to like put this into plainer English.
This is a crazy 4D chess move.
Yeah, it is. It's wild. They submit a bill that they don't like, but they think that the bill will be disliked equally by their northern counterparts. However, tariffs are still enjoyed in the North. So they think that by putting a bill out with tariffs and then having the northern congressmen reject it, they can point the finger at the northern congressmen, make them look like the bad guy for rejecting the bill and getting rid of the tariffs that are supposed to protect the northern manufacturers.
Yeah.
Except they were wrong, that the northerners would withdraw the bill. And it turns out that as long as the bill included the tariffs that the northerners wanted, they were okay with having the tariffs that hurt them as well. So the northerners signed onto the bill. And thus was born the Tariffs of Abominations. So it was a tariff that was across the board. It was on everything. Because that's how the Southerners thought that it would be rejected, is by making it on everything, and then it just passed anyways. And so the Tariff of Abominations, it hurts the economy, but again, like we talked about before, it's more of a political issue.
It only hurts the economy in the South, where they're net consumers.
Yeah.
Because it really does help. It helps a lot with the northern economy. They're not reliant on, foreign, they're not competing with foreign imports as heavily. So now you have these northern manufacturing bases that are selling, more expensive goods to the South, when the South used to be getting cheaper goods from the foreign countries, or, getting, whatever cheaper goods from the North.
And the North is still hurt because, relatively, it's helped on net, but it is hurt somewhat because of the tariffs in the bill for northern goods.
Sure.
Northern imports.
Gotcha.
And so the tariff is like the leading issue in the 1828 election, which pits John Quincy Adams against Andrew Jackson, and it helps Andrew Jackson defeat John Quincy Adams. So even though the Southern congressmen were hoping to use the rejection of the bill to blame the northern congressmen and consolidate support for Jackson, the fact that it passed, and that it passed under the leadership and the presidency of John Quincy Adams, was enough to give Jackson the momentum to take the presidency.
Mm-hmm.
In 1832, you get another change of the tariffs. It's just a slight change, though. The political tensions were really coming to a boil because of fury in the South from these artificially priced goods. And then Congressman Henry Clay came up with a proposal that really cooled the jets a little bit.
Before we get to that, this is when South Carolina says, we're not abiding by your tariff.
Correct.
South Carolina was like, we're done. This is what's called the nullification crisis, right? So this is like South Carolina's almost threatening to secede. Not technically, but they're saying, we're not abiding by the supremacy clause of the Constitution.
Yeah.
We're out. Mm-hmm. We're no longer playing your game. You guys suck. I'm taking my ball and I'm going home.
Yeah. Yeah. They're like, okay, you can have your law, but we're not following it here.
Yes. So then Jackson has to really, really get down here until Henry Clay.
Yeah. Well, Jackson threatens war.
Yeah.
Against South Carolina. That shit gets intense.
It's crazy.
And then Henry Clay comes in. He's a good enough diplomat that he finds a way to ease the tension. He comes up with this proposal to slowly lower the tariffs over the course of 10 years, right? So this is perfect because it gives northern manufacturers enough time to build up their industrial capacity, and it soothes the anxieties of the southerners. It's called the compromise tariff. So again, it just screams how much of a political tool tariffs are, right? And we need to keep that in mind as we're remembering that we're going to fast forward to the modern day.
Yes.
Try to analyze what Trump's tariff proposition might do.
And I want to just call out Henry Clay, best president we never had. You got stolen from you, buddy. You should have been president.
Okay, so the compromise tariff happens. We see the political power of it. And so tariffs continue to go up and down throughout the time leading up to the Civil War after 1832, and even further than that, even up to like 1909, coming up before World War I. So during the Civil War, tariffs are used to raise some money for the Union, but honestly, it's not nearly as much as war bonds or loans. It's another source of income, but it's still mostly a political tool. And our context, again, we have Democrats from the South that want them lower. We have Republicans from the North that want them higher. This kind of starts to get confusing to me because we're about to pivot the alignment of Democrats and Republicans. I'm going to try to keep that in my head.
The pivot begins in 1896 with William Henry Bryant's first run for office. That's like the first thing against McKinley in 1896, and then the party really gets switched in like 1936 FDR.
Okay.
Not the first 1932 election of FDR, the 1936 election. That's when he cements the black vote. But anyway.
Okay. Well, actually, this is important because then, leading up to World War I, tariffs are kind of the one thing that is cementing the Republican Party together. Like, this is the clearest identity. Think with Democrats now, I'm not sure if this is the best thing to say, but high taxes on the rich.
Yeah.
Right? If that's the obvious cement, at least economically, of the Democratic Party today, it was tariffs for the Republican Party in the early 20th century. Democrats, on the other hand, they call it a tax on the little man, right? Yeah. It's like, oh, you're making all these goods more expensive and making it harder for everyone to live. The next important tariff, right, we get to, there's another tariff passed by Howard Taft in 1909, but it doesn't really change the framework of anything.
Yeah.
Which means we actually get to Smoot-Hawley.
But I want to emphasize, after this World War I, or before that World War I era, right? So like post-Civil War, pre-World War I, the whole world enters a time of global bliss. It is a time of global peace, of free trade, of a cosmopolitan world. The 1900s was an incredibly peaceful time. And you never would have known that only 14 years later it would all go up in flames. But like the interconnectivity between nations and their economies in 1900 was incredibly interlinked, incredibly tight.
Wow.
And all that's going to come crashing down after World War I. And then in 1918, we get the buildup of nationalism. We get that buildup. Well, 1914 is obviously the buildup of nationalism, but really 1918, now nations are protecting themselves. They're less reliant on each other. They don't trust each other as much. France wants to outcompete Germany. Germany is angry. Britain is scared. All these countries, they want to build up their own base. And so now we start seeing tariffs come back into fashion. And when the recession hits in 1929, the United States thinks we need a way to spur our manufacturing here at home. What's the best way to do that? By locking out all foreign competitors with high tariffs and only allowing or only making it possible for U.S. consumers to buy U.S. manufactured goods. And then this is when they passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And so what are their reasons?
So after the Depression, who's in office? Woodrow Wilson.
This is still Hoover in 1930.
Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover he's thinking we need to protect American farmers from competition and American manufacturers from competition. To me, this makes very little sense because it was a global downfall.
Yeah, it was a global downfall.
So you needed more circulation of goods, right? But that's not what he did. He thought American farmers needed to be protected, and so he puts tariffs on Europeans, he puts tariffs on Canada, and they retaliate, right? They put tariffs of their own.
They retaliate hard.
Yes.
And before we even get to that retaliation part,
okay,
economists were begging Hoover not to do this. 1,028 economists in the United States wrote a letter to Herbert Hoover at the time in May 1930 and actually begged him, like, please do not do this. Henry Ford and J.P. Morgan also went up to Herbert Hoover and they were like, please don't do this. Okay? So we get into this retaliation, and all these economists and J.P. Morgan and Henry Ford. I'm not going to side with J.P. Morgan or Henry Ford on pretty much anything, but they knew that this was just going to cause a retaliatory strike. And if we look at the vote of a map of the senators who voted for the Smoot-Hawley tariff and who voted against, you can very clearly see the lines between North and South.
Yeah.
It's obvious.
Yeah.
The biggest support for came from states like Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Massachusetts. The biggest against were coming from South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Virginia, Texas. These are the states that are super against this tariff. Okay? So not all countries did retaliate, and it's important to mention that, but a lot did. And we can actually see how American exports differentiated between those who retaliated and those who didn't. Okay? So in American exports to countries that did not retaliate dropped by 18%. But exports to countries that did retaliate dropped 31%. So this is showing the difference in tariffs and what they do to international flow of goods, right? This is lessening the volatility of capital, of goods, of manufacturing. It's making the economy at least a little bit slower.
At least. And probably, and sometimes much slower.
Right, and sometimes much slower. It's a little up in the air how much negativity goes on to the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and we'll get into that. Yeah. But I want to shout out FDR. FDR actually ran against the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in his election cycle in 1932, which makes sense of him being a Democrat. Yep. Makes sense of him, not being from the South, but people always say he has the whole of a Southern man, a soul of a Southern man. People always would say that about him. Okay. He was the governor of New York, but this is what I'm saying here. FDR comes in running against this tariff, and in 1934 he actually succeeds in dropping the tariff, okay? And he works with Congress to pass a law that allows the executive branch the power to bilaterally negotiate trade agreements with other governments, and then be able to pass these negotiations through Congress with a majority support instead of the normal 2/3 support that it would take for a treaty ratification. Okay. So now he's making it easier to negotiate with the international community. This is putting a lot of power in the executive branch, which gives Trump the authority to do stuff like this. It goes all the way back to 1934, which Trump even has the power to pass these types of tariffs. It all stems back from this. But now, let's get into the economics of it, okay? So no economist directly claims that Smoot-Hawley caused the Depression. That is a bogus lie. The economy crashed in 1929, not in 1930. So that's already pretty wrong, okay? Now, imports at this time only formed about 6% of the gross national product of the United States. So only 6% of the U.S. gross national product was coming from exports. So this means with average tariff rates ranging from 40 to 60%, sources of this actually vary. We're not actually totally sure about the direct percentages of what the effective tax rates were in a lot of these cases, but this represents an effective tax of merely 2.4 to 3.6% of the entire economy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not that big of a deal.
Yeah, and the global economy contracted by 17% of GDP, right? So we're talking about just slivers.
Well, in the U.S. specifically, we dropped 31% of GNP.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. was just decimated. So we're talking about 2.4 to 3.6% of the GNP being affected.
It's very little.
It's just not a lot.
So it does kind of show like tariffs. Again, we keep coming back. Economically, tariffs don't seem to do that much
unless you are a net consumer, like the South was. If you're a net consumer, it's going to be a different story. If the U.S. had 40% of their economy, of 40% of their GNP being imports, it would be a different story.
True. Okay. Right? So, do you know of any countries that are that way now?
I'm pretty sure Argentina is a net importer.
Okay. So basically, if you're importing a lot and you're making it harder for yourself to import all that stuff, it's going to hurt.
Yeah. Who would have thought?
Yeah, that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. Okay. So Smoot-Hawley is probably the most famous tariff of all time, right? Yeah. But that's not the end of the story, right? We have World War II and a bunch of time after that, and between the Great Depression and the 70s, as neoliberalism takes hold, the consensus kind of shifts to low or no tariffs and free trade, which again, based on what we're talking about here, I can't find a way to really take a stand against.
Yeah, most of the time. There isn't too much, unless you're an importing nation where you're importing 40% of your stuff.
Yeah.
It's not really the right move.
No, it doesn't seem to be that way. But then in the 70s, you do have another situation where it seems like tariffs might be more useful. manufacturing in the Sun Belt gets hit hard by foreign competition, right? By foreign car makers, foreign steel makers, textile manufacturers. Heavy manufacturing and textiles, exactly what we've been talking about since the beginning of this conversation. And so the unions that are formed around these, specifically the UAW, is a huge supporter of tariffs to prevent the imports of foreign cars. I don't think they actually get any pass, but it just becomes a bigger part of the political conversation. Tariffs since haven't been a huge deal since Donald Trump.
Trump kind of brings them back into fruition here.
Yeah.
And he, during his time in office, he puts tariffs on Chinese goods. He puts tariffs on aluminum imports from Canada. He puts tariffs on steel. And the economic impacts of this are pretty clear.
Yeah.
The economic impact is bad. And it's bad, especially the imports of steel and the tariffs on steel and aluminum. Those were bad policies. Pretty much every economist agrees. You're not going to find anyone who supports them. You'll find workers who do, though. And the workers in these steel plants are very happy that Trump put those tariffs on. The workers in those aluminum plants and the business owners of those aluminum plants and those steel plants, they're very happy with Trump putting those tariffs on. And so it makes it a pretty hard dichotomy, because now you're definitely picking winners and losers with the tariff policy. You're choosing to benefit the steel worker over the American consumer. Now, there are other things one of the big things that I hate about tariffs, and I'm going to repeat this over and over again on the show, is I'm against tariffs on input products, okay? When we're talking about things that are used to make other things, that is the worst thing that we could tariff, okay? Because what we want to be making is the highest value thing, which is at the end of the value chain. We don't want to be focused on the lower quality stuff and the lower tier stuff. We don't want to do that. That's where the bullshit jobs are. Right? We don't want to make it more difficult to get our manufactured products and our finished goods. We want to make those as cheap as possible. So these input goods it's just not the way to go by tariffing them. At least I don't think so.
So then, no, I think I agree. So then the only question remains, what about tariffing finished goods? Right? Like, say we get washing machines from China. And then you start to think, well, what if we're getting washing machines from China? Washing machines aren't that crazy to make somewhere else, like Mexico, right? So, but more importantly, like, why can't we get washing machines from China? And you end up realizing that it's more just that we're generally trying to attack China with these policies.
It becomes a weapon. And that's what it really is. Trump's tariff policy shouldn't be looked at as an economic policy.
No.
It shouldn't even be looked at in the vein of domestic expansion, to be honest. It should really be looked at attacking China.
Yes, because this Chinese manufacturing is not just going to come back to the U.S. It's going to go to the Philippines.
It's going to go to
Vietnam, Mexico, and other countries that have a similarly skilled and populous workforce, right? So
with lax labor laws.
We're not talking. I mean, there are some exceptions, because I do want to give credit, right? EVs.
Sure.
A tariff on Chinese EVs is going to help manufacturing that is popping up in the U.S.
But why? Because it's a high value, finished manufactured product, right? It's super high on the value chain, so other countries couldn't pick that up. Only the U.S. could pick that up.
I mean, other countries could. There's talk of like EV manufacturing plants popping up in Mexico, but there's
but that'll be using U.S. capital. But yes, I know what you mean.
And there's an interest in having this be completely controlled within our country. About us never having to worry about losing that capacity. Same thing with solar panels.
And that's why the IRA, with the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically encouraging U.S. investments.
Yes, but we've talked about this before too. Like, the only reason to worry about like why would China stop selling us those? Why would China stop selling us their EVs or their solar panels? They have the manufacturing capacity. They have the infrastructure built up to make all of these things. And those technologies, just like we talked about with Europe and China earlier in this episode, those technologies are essential in fighting this larger battle against climate change, right? And so the only reason not to do so, we have these pros of taking these cheap goods from China. The reason not to do so is try to hurt China, to try to hurt their economy. And so we have to ask the question, is that worth it? We've talked about the specific goods, but let's get into the conversation about the policy that Trump has raised.
Yes.
A tariff on everything.
Everything.
The only way you can look at that is as a weapon, as an attack on China, as a way to take the legs out from its economy. And China is our adversary. We've talked about this many times in the show. China is not a trustworthy actor. They don't behave well in the South China Sea. They bully the countries around them. Damn. But is it worth it? Or is it a good thing to do?
Is it even good for the U.S.?
To completely cripple their economy?
Is it good for the U.S. to cripple China? I think the answer is no.
I agree.
I think we need China to, contract slowly. We don't want them to start contracting so fast that they get scared in some ethno-nationalist spur and invade Taiwan really hastily, right?
Yep.
We don't want them to collapse so hard that millions starve because of lack of food and whatever with their economy shrinking. We don't want that.
No.
Right? We want them to either become a trustworthy actor or, recede in the international stage. And the truth is, time's on the U.S.'s side.
Yes.
China is not going to be around for very long as a long-term international powerhouse. They're just not. They don't have the population to do so.
No.
Which sounds crazy because we're talking about China. But if you listen to our Chinese deep dives and our talks about Chinese depopulation, you know that China has about a decade left.
Yeah, exactly. And so what you're doing is you're trying to cripple this economy, which I'm expecting, again, is for political reasons, because people are going to see it and they're going to say, Trump's tough on China.
Yeah. And again,
That's
I want to
fantastic.
emphasize, it's bad on our economy too.
Yes.
It's going to be bad on us.
And that's the thing. It's going to be only good for political reasons. Meanwhile, it's going to spike inflation here because we still import a massive amount of goods from China.
Yes.
And while in short time that capacity will be built up elsewhere, it's going to take some time. So we're going to see another year, maybe 2 years of spiked inflation because of these enormous and ridiculous and unnecessary tariffs on China just for these political purposes.
And take him at his word. He wants a 60% plus tariff on Chinese goods. That's scary.
No.
That's dangerous.
Yeah,
that's not good.
It's just not good for really anyone involved.
No.
So,
but that's the history of tariffs. That was awesome.
Yeah, I like that.
That was it was like a very interesting lens to look at the United States history through, right?
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite things about history is, every book you read, right? It's like each way history is told it's almost the same story, right? How many times can you read about, the New Deal? But if you read Lyndon Johnson, The Path to Power by Robert Caro, you read about the New Deal through the eyes of a congressional backbencher who's trying to make his way through Congress. If you read, the Too Big to Fail, you learn about the 2008 financial crisis through the eyes of the Lehman Brothers executives. Mm-hmm. And you see these different lenses. And right now we walk through the history of the United States through the lens of tariffs and how it affected everything. So hope you learned. All right.
Hope so. Bye, guys.
Bye.